Welcome, everybody, to another fine event with our authors reading and interview series here at Space Cowboy Books. I am your host, Jean-Paul Garnier, and this evening we have with us Gideon Marcus. Gideon Marcus is a three-time Hugo finalist, the founder of both Galactic Journey and Journey Press, and along with Janice Marcus, was the winner of the 2020 Space Cowboy Award, our first inaugural award. He's published short stories both in Dark Matter magazine and in our very own Simultaneous Times podcast. Today, we are celebrating the release of Sirena, which is the second book in the Keitra saga. Book one was Keitra. And I'm going to hand it over to Gideon to read an excerpt from the book, and then we will move into the interview segment of the event. If anyone has any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. And I will also be putting links to Gideon's books in the chat as well. So on to you, Gideon.
Thank you. I just came back from Atlanta and read the fourth chapter of Keitra, which was exactly 15 minutes long, and it went over well and was very cool. But that's not what I'm going to be reading tonight because I promised Sirena, and so I'm going to read just 4 pages from Sirena. I promise it will not constitute a spoiler for any of you who have not read Keitra yet, at least not much of a spoiler. All right, here we go. Chapter 8. It took about an hour and a half at 1/2 a G's thrust to match orbits and close in on the mystery ship. By then it was clear that there weren't any colonies on the far side of the planet. There couldn't be. The other hemisphere had no sizable land masses, though there were strings of archipelagos marking the tips of undersea mountain ranges. The back side of the planet was still mostly in shadow, but deep radar made it clear that there were no settlements of any size to be found. Marta was still coming up empty on the comm bands, too. All except the beacon on the bogey, the strange vessel, which we picked up more and more clearly as we approached. A set of chimes on 3 frequencies that said little more than, "I'm here." From our new vantage, the outlines of the unidentified ship were crisp. The sun was now almost perpendicular to it, leaving the cylinder half lit. The curved hull and the flat end of the bogey were somewhat, but not entirely smooth. Its projections stood out starkly against shadows so dark that they revealed nothing underneath. The whole thing was big, almost as big as the Transrift ferry. It had to have crossed the rift under its own power, which meant there was at least a Type 5 drive in there somewhere. That made it military, government, or corporate owned. It didn't look like any warship I'd ever seen. "How close are we going to get?" Peter asked. He tried to keep his tone casual, but I heard the edge of nervousness. "Close enough to know what's going on," I said simply, then added quickly with a glance at Sirena, "if that's all right with you." "I want to solve the mystery too, Marta. Is he still dead?" "He? The ship, darling. Ships are he, are they not?" "She," Farid murmured. "Neither," I said a little too loudly. Peter suppressed a chuckle. "Quite," Sirena said after the briefest of pauses. "How is the ship?" "I'm able to get a better map of emissions from here, though Peter would be better at explaining what they mean." "Right," Peter said. He did something, and the bogey filled the screen. It was painted in a muted network of colors, mostly hoops that girdled the vessel. There's still power being generated. You can see the purple glow along the axis down at that one end. It's being transmitted throughout the vessel, too. But if that engine's as big as I think it is, it's putting out too little energy to be in anything but standby mode. Focusing on work had steadied his voice, or maybe a powered-down ship was less threatening. "Oh, this is interesting," I heard Farid murmur. "What's up?" I asked. He was running a hand through his hair, one eyebrow raised. "If we get close enough, or maybe inside, I can query their ship's Sayer. It's got a public access channel." "You can't do it from here?" He shook his head. "Signal's too weak. I can tell a connection can be made, but I can't make one." I frowned. I hadn't thought of actually boarding the thing. "How would we get in?" Peter walked up and put a hand on my seat, the other pointing at the rainbow schematic in the window. "Ships this big usually have a dock or bay for tenders on the axis. It's probably not on this end of the bogey given the power paths. We'd need to go to the front." I swiveled in my chair to look up at him, then to the rest of my friends in turn. It was too big a decision to make by myself. "Do we do this?" I asked. Marta nodded without hesitation. "I think we have to check it out. If they've got a rightful claim, we need to confirm it. If they're in trouble, we have to render assistance under the laws of space." There were nods and rumbles of agreement. I turned back to the window, considering the bogey one last time. I deliberately put Majera behind the cylinder in the same orbit on instinct. It's much faster to dock with something passive when you're coplanar. You just slow yourself into a slightly lower orbit, which actually speeds you up because you're making a smaller circle, and then wait for the target to slide above you as you pass it. A quick bit of thrusting gets you right next to it, or in this case, in front, for docking. It's the kind of elementary operation a ship sayer can do with ease, if it knows where it's supposed to end up after the maneuver. But we weren't sure where the bogey's dock was, and in any event, I was eager to do a little bit of orbital maneuvering. I took the sticks and gave it a try. It was trickier than I'd thought. I'd handled the orbital change just fine, but as we passed under the mystery ship, I muffed the nudge back into its orbit, ending up slightly above the thing. Now it was gaining on us, looming closer and closer. Lord, the thing was enormous. I kept my cool and nudged the thrusters, spiraling in just ahead of the bogey. It was like playing tag with a hover bus. Finally, sweat on my forehead, I managed to park Majera in orbit just in front of the cylinder, maybe 100 meters away. The bogey was an array of semicircles from here, the sun half illuminating all the raised surfaces. There were no external lights to guide us. It was only then that I realized how quiet everything had gotten. I let out my breath in a gusty exhale and heard the rest follow suit, followed by a nervous, high-pitched laugh that could have been Marta or Peter. Well, here we are, I said. Are we going to have to put on suits and leap the rest of the way? Are you serious? That was Sirena, surprise heightening her accent. No problem, Peter said with a wry tinge to his words. We do this all the time. You just load Pinky into the airlock, evacuate the air, and shoot him at the center. What happens when he goes boing? Marta asked. What happens when I go splat? Pinky replied, but he flushed an amused salmon color. I don't think we'll have to do any spacewalking, Farid said calmly. I've got a strong signal here. I think I can query their ship's SAR and get it to open up. I looked at him in puzzlement. Aren't there security measures to keep that from happening? Oh, sure, he said, smiling with a mysterious air. Then he grinned more broadly. Actually, defensive protocols aren't very robust on civilian ships. It's not like they plan to repel boarders like in the old wet navies. And anyway, he trailed off. Slim fingers played over his console and his eyes narrowed in concentration. Yeah, I kind of expected this. This bogey's in emergency standby mode. Could that ship be, I don't know, hibernating? I asked. He shook his head, the short ponytail waggling. That'd look different. This ship sayer is completely open to external control. No defensive protocols at all, like it restarted from scratch. Farid looked fixedly at me. I think something's happened to the ship. That makes sense with what I'm seeing too, Peter chimed in. What little power there is isn't being distributed evenly. There are several middle decks that look cut off. The sweat was clamming my underarms. What have we gotten ourselves into? So you can, I coughed, cleared my throat. You can cycle their locks so we can slide in? I asked. Farid nodded. Yeah, I have full control. Deep breath. Then, okay, trigger their running lights if they've got any. If nothing explodes, I guess we're going in.
Thank you, Gideon, for giving us a taste of Sirena. Now we're going to move on to the interview portion of the event. Again, if anyone from the audience has any questions, please drop them in the chat. We'll make sure to get to all of them. So for starters, I wanted to ask you, Gideon, what made you want to write in the style of the old science fiction juveniles versus writing adult science fiction? And what are some of your favorites from the genre?
So I write books the way I make covers, which is to say that I don't tend to read many new things, and so I don't know what the current trends are. So I write whatever I want to read. I really wanted to read science fiction that had some hardness to it, but was still accessible and had a good story. That was a particularly crunchy passage, but also accessible, right? So I've got a 17-year-old daughter. She was 15 when I started Sirena, and I wanted her to be able to enjoy it as much as someone who's 39 like you and me. And so that was the motivation for that. And that's a style that I don't think has existed for a long time. There's not a lot of space fiction out there, and most YA fiction tends to be dark and dystopian. And I didn't want to do any of that because I don't like reading that. As far as what's best from the time, I'm actually reading a really good Andre Norton right now called Moon of Three Rings. And I didn't expect to enjoy it that much. I like Andre Norton sometimes. Sometimes I don't find her work very great, but this one's really interesting and a neat sort of mix of science fiction and fantasy. Heinlein's got some good ones, like Starman Jones, I think, is a good one. Have Spacesuit Will Travel is great, although the middle second doesn't really go anywhere. And of course, The Menace from Earth is one of the best stories. I started Lorelei on that when she was 11. And she said, is there more science fiction like this starring a girl like my age? And I'm like, not a lot. So that's why I wrote Sirena, long story short.
And why do you think it is that what we used to call the juvenile sort of went away, replaced by the more dystopian YA?
I don't really know. I think, I mean, juvenile is kind of an unfortunate term, right? And then science fiction itself often gets termed as juvenile in and of itself. I think we were talking about this over at Multiverse Con this weekend. We have this idea, if we grew up in the 80s, that science fiction was something that had always been around and always would be around. But really, science fiction was ascendant for a few decades, and now is in decline. And fantasy, which had been dead up until the early 60s, suddenly exploded, and now it's the popular thing. So science fiction is definitely the smaller sister to fantasy, and science fiction has sort of got, kind of like heavy metal has been incorporated into every other genre of music. Science fiction has become kind of part and parcel. I mean, you could argue that the MCU is science fiction, for instance. So I think what happened was juveniles were written as a gateway to the prevailing genre, and science fiction is no longer the prevailing genre. So YA is sort of the gateway to fantasy, mainstream fantasy, and incidentally, occasionally science fiction. And I understand science YA space is still being done. My work often gets compared to Becky Chambers, who I've not read, but she must be good because I get compared to her.
And you are a man who wears many hats. One of them is you are a space historian. How has being a space historian changed both your writing and your reading of science fiction?
Well, I have to wear many hats because, as you can see, I'm losing my hair. So being a space historian means that I have no tolerance for inaccuracy in my work. You won't, if you're reading it, you're going to enjoy a fun adventure, and the science is going to be pretty much invisible. Although I think my favorite review was, yeah, leave it to Gideon to actually teach me something while he's entertaining me. I don't have a lot of tolerance for inaccuracy in other people's work as a result, but at least I can walk the walk. But I love to teach, and so my science fiction always has an element of education in it, but it's invisible, right? It's just part of it. But you can know if you read it that it's probably pretty sound science, and the planets that you see look like planets that might really exist, and so forth.
And you do a lot of coverage of the unmanned era of the space race. How do you balance that with keeping up on modern space technology and integrating that into your fiction?
I learned something very valuable from David Brin. In the 80s, he wrote a book called Startide Rising, which is still one of my very favorite books. I make it a habit to keep copies of it so I can give it away. And it won the Hugo back in 84, I think, 86. And then he wrote a whole series called The Uplift Saga. So I always pimp David, who was on your show recently, because he's a neighbor, actually. He's only 10 miles away. His science fiction is timeless, because he is very good at not showing the nuts and bolts of his science fiction. Things just work and they make some sense. If you work too hard to make your science really current, then it will be out of date in 5 years. Larry Niven's work suffers heavily from that. So I don't have to keep very up to date with modern science. I do with the astronomy part, right? The universe is going to be the universe for a long time. And so when I'm describing planets and stars and orbital mechanics and discovering planets with radial velocity, that stuff I don't think is going to change. But in terms of what people use for computing and so forth, I keep that very vague, because I'm hoping that my work will stay current for decades, centuries to come.
I did hear recently it being said that when it comes to things that date in science fiction versus things that do not, that it's often the things expressed in hard science fiction that date versus the soft sciences, sociology, psychology. These things don't date as quickly. I wondered if you had any thoughts about that as a hard science fiction writer.
So I think you can always tell what era a science fiction book came out by how they treat marginalized people. The one exception to that, of course, is Tom Purdum's I Want the Stars, which came out in 1964 and reads like it was written yesterday, because that's a book that has polyamory and homosexuality and lots of different demographics, and absolutely no mention is made of it except that it exists. And that's the kind of future I've tried to make in the Keetra saga, where there just is no distinction based on your gender preference or your gender whatsoever, although there are still religious issues. Cultural values are something that get incorporated into science fiction and date science fiction. And I think they can be kept vague or properly presented in such a way that they last longer too.
And you had told me when Keetra, the first book, came out, that this is intended to be a 10-book series, a real epic saga. So I wanted to ask, what challenges arose for you during the writing of book 2 in the series, and how did the process differ for you from writing book 1?
Well, I had to make sure Pinky's colors were consistent from book to book. That was really important. I have a little document called Pinky Colors because Pinky has a lot of colors and he communicates that way. Luckily, his farts remain consistent between the two books, so that's a good thing. Now, Sirena was actually pretty similar in the way I put it together as Keetra. All the books stand largely alone, and they all end satisfyingly, so no one feels like they got cheated if they buy a book. Although, interestingly enough, I went to a bookstore in Georgia, and their book club had read Sirena, but not Keetra. And they liked Sirena, and they said the story does stand alone, but they wondered what character and universe building they had missed in Keetra. And I said, well, the good thing is this bookstore carries Keetra. So they all bought Keetra, and I can't wait to see what they think. Obviously, as the series goes on, it will be harder and harder to make standalone books because they will be building on what came before. But I will do my best. I know Jim Butcher was pretty good at that. By book 12 or 13 of the Dresden Files, he could summarize everything within a short time and relatively entertainingly. But yeah, it was not too difficult. The nice thing is all 10 books are plotted. So I'm not going to have writer's block. It's really just a matter of how much time I'll have. I'm actually planning on writing the very first line of the sequel to Sirena. It's called Hivilma tonight. So literally after this phone call, I will put pen to paper and the very first sentence of Hivilma will be written.
Well, that's exciting. Another thing about the series is if I'm remembering correctly, the books are set about 1,000 years in the future. So what intrigues and challenges come about while working with such a distant future versus writing, say, a near future science fiction story?
I wanted to create a far enough time ahead that I could play around with society. But also close enough that things are still recognizable. If you go back 1,000 years, there are still recognizable cultures. They still have a Roman Empire, even though it had fallen 1,000 years before. But we know what a Roman Empire is today. We recognize China, even though China is obviously different politically today. The major difference, of course, is the Americas, right? So I wanted to have elements of familiarity. So the Keetraverse is set in sort of this neo-Levantine society where you've got Turkish and French, this Middle Eastern sort of melange, and then I threw Finnish on top of that because you need something unusual. The biggest challenge really hasn't surfaced yet, but one of the big things that's going to come up is Keetra is Jewish, but her Judaism is not modern day Judaism. It's actually been somewhat syncretized with Islam. And the state religion is Judaism with these Islamic flavor, or someone might say it's Islam with a Jewish flavor. And I don't think that's that weird. I mean, look at how Jews celebrate Hanukkah right now, which essentially is Christmas, at least in the West. And Hanukkah was never anything like Christmas before Jews were in American culture. And that's something I want to write with sensitivity and realism, but it's also something I really want to have in there. And I don't know if I'm going to piss off Jews and Muslims or if they're going to appreciate it.
It sounds like worthwhile to take on for sure. And that's another thing I wanted to ask you. There are several Turkish influences in the book. Can you elaborate on that a little bit and what your motivations are for using the Turkish influences?
I just really like Turkey, and there's a thing when you want to predict the future, right? You find your second tier regional powers and you posit that they are going to be the next up and comer, right? So there's these big countries that people tend to ignore despite them being important. Indonesia is one. Pakistan is one. We tend to think of Pakistan as a small country because it's bordered by India, but it's in the top 6 population wise. It just happens to be next to number 1 on both sides, right? China and India. And so Turkey is one of those powers that it once was a great power, and it's important regional power, and it's not in a typical, right? It's Islamic, but it's ostensibly secular, although that's changing unfortunately these days. It's not Indo-European, but it's not like Eastern Asian. It's at this crossroads of the entire world. It's bordering Europe. It's close to Africa. So it was just a really interesting place. And also it's next to Israel, which is where my mom is from. And so that region has extra allure for me.
And there's several really cool alien species in the series. I'm not going to say a whole lot because I don't want to give any spoilers away. Pinky, obviously. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about your process in the creation of alien species, and can we anticipate meeting more in future books in the series? And that being said, what are your thoughts on alien life in the universe? Do you use your scientific background going into the process of creation of these, and so forth?
You've used up your question quota. I'm sorry, I'm going to leave now. So I'll start with the last one first. I actually don't believe that we will ever encounter any intelligent aliens that we can understand. And it's funny too, because when I say that often, people will go, that is so arrogant to believe that we're alone. And I say the arrogance works the other way, to think that because we exist, something like us exists. It took us 4 billion years to get here. If you take the slice of history when we've been spacebound, it is invisibly thin. Any aliens that exist, I think intelligent aliens probably exist, but they're going to be so far away, and they're going to be either so behind us technologically that they can't communicate with us, or they're going to be so ahead of us that we won't be of any interest to them. That said, aliens are cool. So I've compromised, and there's a very few aliens in my universe. There are 3 main ones, 2 of which have only gotten the barest of mentions, the bugs and the grilled cheese. Not the grilled cheese, but the grilled cheese. And the grilled cheese are just completely alien people that we are fighting for no other reason than they don't want us to be in their systems. And we don't even want the same planets, but their very existence finds our existence unfortunate. And so there's this border war going on. There's the bugs who can see into hyperspace. And we'll probably meet a bug in book 5. And then there's Pinky and his race. And we've only met one so far, but a lot of people really liked Pinky and wanted to know more about him. And I can tell you that readers of Sirena will not be disappointed. There's some very important Pinky scenes that give a little bit of insight and show that underneath the fart jokes and the dad humor, there's something significant underneath, and it's not just marshmallow. And there will be at least one other significant alien race, and I won't say anything more about that. Actually, I will say there will be 2 more significant alien races in the Keetra books, both of which will have a profound effect on Keetra at some point.
I tend to agree with you that if there probably is intelligent life in the universe, but communication is going to be problematic at best. We can't even tell what our home pets are thinking or trying to communicate or the octopus, which is a heavy contender for sentience, with some sort of language of its own, and we can't make heads or tails of it. So I tend to agree with you there. The next question, I have a feeling I know how you're going to answer this, but if human beings ever do colonize the galaxy, which is obviously quite a ways off, if we do, what do you think that will actually look like? And how do you think it will differ from the universe that you've portrayed in your books?
The colonization in Ketra depends on faster than light travel, and faster than light travel being developed in waves of speed. So in the Ketraverse, you had this first flush of exploration with quite slow vessels that took a long time to go. And so you had this big ring of worlds that were somewhat separated. You couldn't really have a government across any distance because it just took too long to reach things. And then you had faster than light be developed, and you had this empire sort of build up and take over these midworlds, not entirely peacefully. Although some people have said another evil empire, I'm like, it's not an evil empire; it's a constitutional monarchy. You know, it's as evil as Sweden. But is that the way it's going to happen? There's no way to know. If we never have faster than light, then colonizing the stars is going to have to be with generation ships or sleeper ships, if that's even possible. And then we'll spread out, but each society is going to be quite isolated from every other one, and that's assuming we even find a way to inhabit other planets. If we have faster than light travel, then all bets are off, and any number of cultures can arise. The political structure in the Ketraverse is just one of many. The Ketraverse Empire actually is not aware of any other human polities. They know Earth exists, and they suspect that other big countries colonize huge other swaths of the galaxy, but they don't have direct contact with them, partly because the grill cheese are in the way. So yeah, there could be, actually, strike that. I do know of at least one polity and what its structure is like, and it's fascinating, and their FTL is completely different, and their politics is completely different, and they're based on Greek and Persian fusion, and we'll probably never see them in the Ketraverse, but at some point I might write a spin-off story involving them.
And have you heard of the new developments in solar sail pushed by lasers that could potentially give us faster than light travel? If you have heard of this more modern spacecraft, what are your thoughts on that?
I'm not sure how you push a solar sail faster than light. How does that work?
I think because they're powered by laser, the push of the photons as a faux solar wind, that the acceleration would be exponential, since you're basic, sort of the way an ion drive works. But
it's not going to be FTL, because you still have as you approach the speed of light, you're going to reach infinite mass. So
it won't be FTL, but it'll approach the speed of light. Now, how they plan on slowing these things down, that's problematic, but the solar sails have been tested now. I wonder if you've been keeping up on any of the planetary societies work with that.
Solar sails have actually been conceived for space travel since the 70s. And the idea, Moten God's Eye is a classic example of that. Not a classic example of a great book, but it is a classic example of the implementation of lasers. Yeah, you launch it from your planet, you beam a laser at it, and then you spend the rest of the time backwards decelerating with the target's sun. And you can get a decent fraction of the speed of light with that. And it's cool. It is a way to do it. Again, it's so slow that you may end up spreading humanity around, but the colonies will not be talking to each other with any real meaningful connection.
Indeed. So you're also the founder of both Galactic Journey and Journey Press. I wonder if you could tell our audience, if they're unfamiliar, a little bit about these endeavors and what's coming up next for both.
So galacticjourney.org is our time machine to exactly 55 years ago. It is currently October 19th, 1966. Tomorrow, we're going to be watching the Star Trek episode, What Are Little Girls Made Of? And when I say we, I mean everybody who is watching is welcome to join us. We broadcast at 8:30 on Pacific and Eastern times. Paramount, please do not shut us down. This is a private party. And it's got the original commercials, and it's got Daniel Boone before it. And it's just been a lot of fun. We've been doing it like this since early September. And writing articles about it that you can see on Galactic Journey. But we don't just cover Star Trek. We reviewed an Ursula K. Le Guin book just a couple of days ago. We cover fashion, politics, all of the science fiction magazines of the day, all the space shots. We have another professional space historian from Australia who's been doing all our space articles lately. Gemini 12 is going to launch next month. So if you want an immersion like you've never seen before, but done in a readable format that's a lot of fun, come to galacticjourney.org. Our other project, which is kind of an outgrowth of Galactic Journey, is Journey Press at journeypress.com. And that is our publishing house that we started in 2019. And we're actually doing pretty good. Our books can be found in most independent bookstores in the country, including our favorite, Space Cowboy Books. It was actually really cool. We were at the convention Multiverse, and we ran out of our own books to sell. And so we just sent everybody to read it again that had a booth in the dealer hall. We're kind of unusual in that we're a modern small press, but we do most of our sales through independent bookstores because we love them. As for books, we came out as a queer press in June. Not everything we do is queer, but a lot of it is, and a lot of our creators are, and majority rules. So we said call a duck a duck. Our latest book was Sirena, but our next book is really exciting. Janice Newman, a Hugo finalist, is coming out with her very first book. It is a trio of speculative fiction romances. And this is a genre I don't know really exists. I mean, there's paranormal romance, but her work has a hard science fiction story that's a romance. It's got a paranormal story, which is a romance, and it has a fantasy story that's a romance. And they're all in one book. It's really good. We're basically hoping, well, we're not hoping. Our mission is to take these genres that we like that are not particularly the trend right now and make people love them so much that we set the trend and people then try to capitalize on it. But they won't do it as well as us. Next year, we've got the next volume of Rediscovery coming out. That one's already in the works. We have a wonderful book coming out for Pride Month next year called By Your Side, the First Century of Yuri in anime and manga, which is lesbian relations in Yuri and manga, anime and manga. It's the flip side of yaoi, which is gay. And then we have a very special announcement for September, and I cannot say who it is, but when you see it, you will be like, oh my God, they got this amazing author. And I just got an amazing submission today, actually. So it's really exciting times. We're very happy with what we're coming out with. We have like 5 books a year. It's not a lot, but they're all really good.
Wonderful. Everything I've read so far certainly has been. But forget today for a second. What is the hottest thing going on in 1966 currently?
Well, aside from Star Trek, psychedelic rock is all the thing. The Beatles came out with their Revolver, which is just a trip, and the Beach Boys have Pet Sounds, which, if not exactly listenable, it is interesting. Actually, Good Vibrations just came out. It's the most expensive pop song to date, $50,000, recorded in 6 sessions. It's quite amazing. Listen to Good Vibrations. It will blow your mind. The only thing I think that limits it is that it is, of course, a typical Mike Love song because he can't do anything else. But yeah, so that's what's hot right now. And the Vietnam War, which is not so great.
Indeed. So as the author hat that you also wear, what are you currently working on? I know you're starting book 3 tonight, but what's next for you? And can you give us any hints as to what we can expect from book 3 in the Keetra saga?
So 2 things. One, at some point, I'm going to put together all the short stories that I've written, both published and unpublished. All of them have made somebody's final list somewhere. But I'm going to open the book with a foreword which says this: you're about to read a bunch of rejects, because of course all of them were rejected at some point. But I don't know when that's coming out. Probably end of next year. Hivilma is going to be a departure. That's all I will say. Keitra and Sirena have somewhat similar structures. You know, Keitra gets her ship together and they fly off and interesting things happen, and then happy ending at the end. All I will say about Hivilma is it will change the mold, but I think you'll still like it.
And can we expect more fantastical elements, or are you going to stick more to the hard sci-fi aspect?
Well, you know, any sufficiently advanced technology. But I'll excuse me. The Keitra saga is always going to be hard science, even if it gets truly wondrous in its presentation.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Gideon. Tonight we've had Gideon Marcus reading from Sirena, the book that was just released, and there are links in the chat for that. Of course, you can get it at Space Cowboy Books and most independent bookstores around the country. Gideon, I want to thank you for your support of independent bookstores. I know that is a harder road to take, but it is a very admirable one, and it means a lot to not only myself, but I think to our culture at large and what independent bookstores mean and independent publishing means. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. If you have any final statements, I'll give you the opportunity to let them out now.
I was reminded to point out that Laura Weir also will have a book coming out next year. She did The Eighth Key, which was our high fantasy gay romance, which I understand you liked. So that makes me happy. And this one is going to be a retelling of a classic fairy tale. And it's going to be a female romance this time. So we're excited about that one. Other than that, if you want to join us for Star Trek, all you have to do is send me an email and I will add you to the list. Tomorrow morning, I will be sending out instructions on how to join us. Also, the review of last week's episode will be coming out tomorrow morning, and there will be a link at the bottom of that.
Wonderful. You can find links in the chat to both Galactic Journey and Journey Press, where all these fine books are coming from and all this wonderful reviews. Thank you so much to our audience tonight. And thank you, Gideon. We will see you next time.
Thanks so much. Thanks, everybody.